Chizuo Matsumoto was born on March 2nd, 1955, into poverty in Kumamoto, Japan. And he was one of 7 children. And Matsumoto's father was a simple tatami maker, which was like soft mats. And the family's circumstances were so dire that basic necessities were often really hard to come by. And to make matters more challenging, Chizuo was born with severe visual impairments. He was basically completely blind in his left eye and only partially sighted in his right, retaining about 30% vision. At least that's what the sources say. It's not for sure, but it is for sure that one of his eyes was less visually impaired. So he's definitely starting life with a lot of disadvantages, but still no excuse to be the person you became. So stay tuned for that. So in a rural society, being poor was hard enough, obviously, but being disabled and poor made Matsumoto an object of pity and, at times, scorn. So his parents, struggling to support so many children, sought help from the government for their blind sons. Because Chizuo actually had an older brother who was completely blind. So this poor family has 2 kids that are almost completely blind and they're poor. It's just really bad beginnings. So with one completely blind child and one almost blind child, the family became aware of state-funded educational opportunities for visually impaired children. So at age 6, Chizuo Matsumoto was sent away to a special boarding school for the blind in Kumamoto City. And the school was subsidized by the government, offering free education and lodging, which eased the financial burden on the family because they had so many kids, you know? However, it also meant young Chizuo grew up largely separated from his parents and siblings from a very early age. That usually isn't a good recipe. And the environment he entered would profoundly shape him, as we will see. So at the school for the blind, Matsumoto had an unusual status because he could see a bit, because the school was officially meant for students with little or no sight. So this gave him a natural edge over his completely blind peers, and he did not hesitate to exploit that shit, which is really f***ed up. So a former teacher later noted that a child with any vision in that setting held prestige amongst the other children, because the blind children in that school just craved guides who could lead them outside school to experience ordinary pleasures like visiting a cafe for coffee or a restaurant for a good meal. Just like the most simple things that we all take for granted in life. And classmates would treat young Chizuo Matsumoto to food or favors in exchange for his guidance, which gave him a sense of power and entitlement from a very young age. He was like a cult leader amongst these poor blind kids, like just building this ego brick by brick. Because you'd look at that initially and be like, oh my gosh, that is so sweet. Like, you know, they have somebody to look up to and they're really sweet. But he had like a bad thing happening in his brain when he was doing this. He was like, oh, I'm better than them. It wasn't like I'm selfless. It's like I'm selfish and I'm going to take advantage of this kind of thing. So Matsumoto's visual disability shaped his childhood as we know. But instead of softening him, it seemed to fuel a need to dominate. And in this case, other children. So at the Kumamoto School for the Blind, he grew up in dormitories, often experiencing isolation and rejection, at least at the beginning. Yet the classmates and teachers noted that he was often the one causing any sort of torment and acting as a bully who ruled the dorm. So he claimed he was a victim, but in reality, he was a giant bully. Because for one, he exploited others' blindness, issuing contradictory commands to just confuse them, then berate them for following his orders. It's so incredibly cruel for such a young person. And one classmate even remembered how he'd tell someone not to do something, then moments later demand them to do it. So it's like he's playing this really f***ed up, domineering ping pong with these poor blind kids. And then when he would demand them to do something, he would scream at them for not obeying. It was just like, I can't even imagine how these poor kids felt. And during a local burglary scare, he forced his roommates to stay up all night on guard while he slept peacefully, just because he could, and because they didn't know better. And he often violated dorm rules, keeping lights on or making noise. And when confronted by his dorm mother, he threatened, quote, "I'll set this dorm on fire." You know, like other 8-year-olds do. And a teacher challenged him on this, obviously, but Matsumoto coldly replied that words weren't a crime, adding, quote, "I'll shoot you to death as long as I don't really shoot. It's not against the law." What? What is this kid, man? It's absolutely insane. So his just utter audacity frightened the children, but also the staff. And even then, he showed traits of manipulation, defiance, and disdain for rules that would later define his adult persona. But still, he could be complex, playing that empathetic confidant to outcast students when it served his image, which, what does that sound like? Everybody in the back. Cult leader, exactly. Preying on the lost and weaker to build yourself up, make yourself look like the hero, all just to blow some hot air into your giant head. So obviously, Matsumoto craved status, repeatedly running for student council president in elementary and junior high, but he always lost. Womp womp. Because his classmates were too afraid to vote for him. And in high school, he would beg through tears to be elected, yet he would fail again. And when he asked one of his schoolmates why they wouldn't vote for him, she answered bluntly, quote, "You show concern for people sometimes, but everybody's afraid of you." And the rejection just wounded this guy's ego, because even as a teen, he dreamed of becoming prime minister, but the repeated failures just left him really bitter. And experts later argued that Matsumoto's mix of perceived specialness and social rejection just fueled a narcissistic hunger for power and a deep resentment toward a society that never fully accepted him. So academically, Matsumoto's schooling focused on practical skills for the blind. So he would study traditional East Asian medicine, such as acupuncture, massage therapy, and herbal techniques, which were common vocational fields for visually impaired students in Japan. And he wasn't known as an outstanding student in the conventional sense. Instead, he excelled in cleverness and street smarts. And a teacher would later recall that young Matsumoto was obsessed with money and success. Quote, saying, "He was always saying, 'I've got to get rich,'" one of his teachers noted, adding that Matsumoto scrimped and saved whatever small funds he had, which, that's not a bad thing to do. That's a good thing to instill in your children and everything. But if their entire ego and self-worth relies on being rich and successful and being followed, then you got a problem. Then we need to go to therapy, all right? So perhaps he saw wealth as a path to influence that eluded him in popular contests. But by the time he graduated high school in 1975, Matsumoto had a solid grounding in acupuncture and Chinese herbal medicine. But he just craved more. So he lingered at the school for a couple of years after graduation, possibly teaching younger students or honing his trade, because Matsumoto aspired to higher education. And he would set his sights on university, which was not a typical path for blind school graduates. But in 1973, he attempted to gain admission to Kumamoto University, which was a local college. But yet again, he would fail the entrance exams. Ooh, beating a guy while he's down, building up that cult leader. But undeterred, he aimed even higher, and in 1977, at the age of 22, Matsumoto moved to Tokyo with the bold hope of entering the prestigious University of Tokyo, which was the nation's top university. And this was an immensely ambitious goal for someone with his specific background. And unfortunately, again, he failed the Tokyo University exam as well, dashing his dreams of joining Japan's elite academic ranks. So again, you look at the story not knowing what's about to happen, and you're like, man, this kid he's a little bit of a bully, but he's got some chutzpah. I don't know what the word I'm looking for. He's got some spark in him. He really wants to try, shoot for those stars. But I know what's happening later, so I don't care. So naturally, these educational failures were devastating to his ego, because Matsumoto had nurtured a vision of himself as a great man in the making, perhaps even a political leader someday, but academia's doors remained closed to him. So facing the end of his formal education with no accolades, Matsumoto pivoted to what he knew best, which was, at the time, acupuncture and alternative medicine. So by his early 20s, Chizuo Matsumoto had tasted enough defeat to harden his resolve. Failing to get into the University of Tokyo was a critical turning point, and it marked the end of his conventional aspirations and the beginning of an unconventional quest for significance. That's what we'll call it. As Matsumoto's youthful dream of becoming a political or intellectual leader through proper channels was effectively crushed, as we know. And in Japan's highly competitive society, not attending a top university meant slamming into a glass ceiling. And for an ambitious young man who once told classmates he wanted to be prime minister, this was a bitter pill to swallow. And swallow it he would not. And Matsumoto's disability might have played a role in these setbacks for sure, though bright, he wasn't able to conquer the rigorous exams. So the sting of these academic failures sharpened his resentment towards Japan's meritocratic system. Because I'm going to safely assume that they didn't really cater to people with disabilities, especially back in the 70s. So it was just all these things kind of stacking up against him that just made him incredibly bitter. Which, I can absolutely understand to a degree, but not to the degree of, wanting to kill people later. But anyway, we'll get to that. So he began to perceive the world as fundamentally unfair, which, that's a fair assumption. But he harbored a belief that destiny had cheated him of his rightful place due to circumstances beyond his control. Namely, his poor vision, poverty, and lack of connections. Which again, very relevant and very prevalent, but not an excuse for what's about to happen. And luckily for Matsumoto himself, he was nothing if not resourceful. So lacking a university credential, he doubled down on the vocational training that he had. And in 1977, after the Tokyo University debacle, he remained in the capital region and set out to make a name for himself in the health and wellness area. So he would open up a small acupuncture clinic just to capitalize on his expertise from the blind school. And at first, he practiced in a modest setting. Reportedly, he started in Kumamoto, his hometown, and then Tokyo, eventually renting a tiny room in Funabashi, Chiba. Sorry if I said that wrong. I'm trying with these pronunciations. I have them written out, but I'm probably still going to pronounce them wrong, so I apologize. But he went there to set up shop. And Matsumoto positioned himself as a healer, offering acupuncture treatments and traditional remedies. And though just scraping by at the time, he felt a first taste of authority in the role of sensei, which is a teacher or a doctor, to paying clients. But making needles relieve backaches was far from the grand influence that he sought. Because at this point with this job, he was still on the fringes of society, and he desired to be in the center. So Matsumoto's crushed dreams just festered. Even as his business was kind of picking up and he was doing a good job, he was just still resentful towards everybody that made him fail. So Matsumoto began to frame his personal disappointments as the fault of corrupt society. And this is a theme that colored his later teachings. So despite personal setbacks, Matsumoto pushed forward in the late 1970s with entrepreneurial zeal. And he expanded beyond acupuncture into the booming market of traditional Chinese medicine, selling herbal health tonics and remedies, and ambitiously calling it a, quote, pharmacy of Chinese medicine. And he would present himself as a holistic healer, blending acupuncture and moxibustion, sorry if I said that wrong, which is a burning herbal heat therapy and herbal supplements. And Japan in the 1980s had a thriving subculture of wellness cures, and Matsumoto aimed to ride that wave, baby. And at first, his small business attracted some customers seeking alternative treatments. And ever the self-promoter, he sold special elixirs that he claimed could improve vitality or cure illnesses, snake oils, basically. He's a big old fraud. However, in his eagerness to make money and lofty claims, Matsumoto crossed legal lines. And in 1982, his entrepreneurial streak landed him in serious trouble. And authorities arrested 27-year-old Matsumoto for practicing pharmacy without a license and peddling unregulated, quote, miracle drugs. Don't try to trick people with drugs. It's really bad. And it's crazy because it still happens today, literally all the time. I can't tell you how many times I go on TikTok and I see people just peddling bullshit like supplements and drugs. It's just sad. But anyway, essentially, he was caught selling fake health tonics that didn't have approval. And the police accused him of fraudulently marketing these concoctions as cure-alls. So Matsumoto was detained for about 20 days and eventually convicted. And he was fined roughly 800 American dollars at the time for the offense. Though the penalty was relatively small, the impact on Matsumoto was huge, because his budding health store went completely bankrupt in the wake of this entire scandal. And more importantly, this incident seemed to permanently sour his view of Japanese authorities and the media. So Matsumoto felt humiliated by the arrest and its public exposure. Well, if it isn't the consequences of your own actions, you know? Crazy. And according to an article his wife later wrote in an Om Shinrikyo publication, they both were left, quote, embittered by how the police and press treated him, because he believed they were persecuted unfairly for simply trying to make a living. A fraudulent living, but whatever. So this was just a narrative of victimization that he would carry into his cult leadership years. So the dream of becoming a respected businessman had completely collapsed. However, in this dark period, Matsumoto's life was about to take a pivotal turn, because instead of chasing yen through dubious medicine, he began turning inward to spiritual pursuits. It's as if his anger toward the earthly system, which was law enforcement, mainstream science, and the press, it drove him to seek a higher validation that society couldn't deny him. The failure of his early business ventures set the stage for Matsumoto to reinvent himself in an entirely new arena, which was the world of religion and mysticism. And amidst the turbulence of his young adulthood, Matsumoto did find personal companionship, because he would marry Tomoko Ishii in 1978. And Tomoko at the time was a college student when they wed, and she would go on to become a very steadfast partner to Matsumoto, later adopting his surname to become Tomoko Matsumoto. I'm sorry if I keep saying Matsumoto or Moto. I apologize. My brain isn't braining today, so I apologize. And the young couple would settle in Chiba near Tokyo, where they worked together on the acupuncture clinic and health store. In fact, Tomoko herself was involved in the herbal medicine business that led to Matsumoto's 1982 arrest. So she was a bad egg too. She didn't give a. But despite the hardship, their marriage would persist, and they would even go on to start a family. And over the years, Matsumoto would father a large number of children. And sources differ on the exact count, but it is known he had at least 6 children with Tomoko. And he had 2 sons and 4 daughters, born between the late 1970s and the late 1980s. And for a few years in the early 1980s, one might have mistaken the Matsumotos for a typical small family trying to get by. An essentially blind acupuncturist husband, a supportive wife, and young kids in a suburban apartment. Innocent enough, you know? But behind closed doors, Chizuo Matsumoto was changing, to say the least, because the collapse of his health business and his brush with the law had deeply shaken him. So he grew disillusioned with material pursuits and started immersing himself in religious literature and yoga. And in those years, he was seeking something. And whether that something was meaning, power, enlightenment, or all of the above, he didn't come at it with great intentions. But the stage was set for Matsumoto's next incarnation. And not as a businessman, nay, but as a guru. And his family would be taken along for that ride. For better or, as it turned out, for much, much worse. So in the early 1980s, as Matsumoto's commercial ventures faltered, he turned fervently towards spiritual exploration. And Japan at the time saw a surge of interest in alternative religions and mysticism, partly as a reaction to the rampant materialism of the economic boom. And Matsumoto found himself drawn to this cultural current, mostly because he saw it and was just like, yeah, I can bullshit my way through that. Let's do it. So he began studying Eastern philosophies, particularly those blending in Hindu and Buddhist practices. And between 1980 and 1984, Matsumoto became an active member of a then popular new religious movement called Agonshu. And Agonshu was a Buddhist-derived sect founded by Kiriyama Seiyu, known for its focus on Agama Sutras, which they believe to contain the original teachings of the Gautama Buddha. And Matsumoto spent several years diligently practicing a Gonshu's rites, and perhaps learning how a modern cult operates by observing Kiriyama's organization. So this was likely his first direct exposure to an organized, quote, new religion, and it clearly made an impression on him. And during this period, Matsumoto also delved into occult and yogic practices on his own. And he studied yoga as both a physical and spiritual discipline, which is great. Yoga's great. I'm not hating on yoga. So he would learn breathing exercises, meditation techniques, and read scripture ranging from Indian sutras to Chinese Taoist texts. And a turning point came when he started claiming personal mystical experiences. Here we go. There it is. He's the middleman for whoever he's talking to that can't be held accountable for anything. It just builds up so perfectly with every cult leader. It's crazy, actually. So around 1984, Matsumoto reportedly journeyed to India and the Himalayas on a sort of spiritual pilgrimage. And there, he sought out holy sites and teachers. And according to later accounts by his cult, Matsumoto spent time in the Himalayas and came back declaring he had attained, quote, ultimate salvation, or satori, which just means enlightenment, during his travels. Amen, brother. And he also claimed that during these quests, he received secret teachings directly from revered figures. And he even alleged that he obtained secret and special knowledge from the Dalai Lama himself. And there is evidence that he did meet the Dalai Lama briefly, as the Tibetan spiritual leader often met many Japanese seekers, though of course not to impart any, quote, secret doctrine, as Matsumoto later boasted. So Matsumoto's head was just filling with a mix of ideas from many different cultures, from Tibetan Buddhism to Hinduism to Taoism and even Western occultism. And he would read Nostradamus' prophecies and Christian Book of Revelation, alongside Asian texts. So he's just like mixing this up. He's putting it in a blender and he's blending the shit out of it and picking out the parts that sound best to him and will be in his favor. What does that sound like? Every cult leader we've literally ever covered. So by 1984, Matsumoto was ready to put what he'd learned into practice and carve out his own spiritual niche. And with a small group of followers he'd gathered from yoga classes, he founded an organization initially known as Om Shinsen no Kai. And the name can be translated as Om Heavenly Sage Association, or Om Immortal Mountain Wizard Association. Yeah. He is really good at names, I'll give him that. And Om specifically is a sacred syllable in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, often written as OM, and Shinsen implies immortal sages or wizards, reflecting Matsumoto's grandiose spiritual aspirations from the very start. Guy saw himself as Gandalf the Grey. Okay, you know how crazy that is? I mean, we all do it in our heads, but we don't actually go in life and be like, hey guys, so you shall not pass, or whatever, you know? But he would launch this group out of his one-bedroom apartment in Shibuya, Tokyo in February 1984. And what began as a humble yoga and meditation class taught by Matsumoto soon evolved into the embryo of a new religion. And in those early days, he wasn't yet viewed as a messiah like he wanted to be. He was more like a charismatic yoga instructor with a twist, a little sprinkle of occultism. And a former student from that time recalled, quote, "We were not followers, but members," suggesting that initially it felt more like a club of like-minded people exploring spiritual development together. However, Matsumoto's persona was already shifting from mere teacher to self-styled guru, and he started to cultivate an aura of mystique. And in 1985, a Japanese occult magazine named Twilight Zone, fittingly, featured him and one of his more extraordinary claims, which was that he had achieved the power of levitation. I shit you not. I mean, about the article, not that he could actually levitate, because he couldn't. But in the article, Matsumoto boasted, quote, "Now the length of time I can levitate is about 3 seconds, but it is gradually lengthening. In about a year, I should be able to fly freely through the sky." So such statements obviously attracted attention from thrill seekers and spiritually curious youths. Because here was a man claiming supernatural powers, talking about clairvoyance, Himalayan wisdom, and offering yoga as the gateway. And Japan's media-savvy public just ate that shit up. And Matsumoto used these claims to draw more people into his classes. And by 1986, he was incorporating more explicitly religious content into his teachings. But according to his later accounts, he had a profound enlightenment experience in the Himalayas, as mentioned earlier, and came back proclaiming that he had reached a state of nirvana. And he began to speak not just of health and personal goals, but of cosmic truths and the end of ordinary morality, just urging people to seek a higher world beyond human existence. And this marked the formation of his religious identity as a whole, because he was setting himself up as someone who had transcended normal human limits. He was quite literally above everyone else in every single way. And Matsumoto would begin positioning himself as an expert who could guide followers to that enlightenment. If you join now, you get a BOGO deal. You can become a part of the cult and you can reach the state of enlightenment for me, but you gotta give me your life first. That's just the catch. I don't make the rules, okay? That guy, or whoever's talking to me, does. It's not me. And his early organization even engaged in quirky PR stunts. For example, they would publish anime-style comics and cartoons, linking Ohm's ideas to popular manga and science fiction themes, trying to resonate with Japan's youth. And for example, from that, Ohm's publications referenced Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels, likening Ohm's members to an elite group, preparing in secret to rebuild civilization after an age of chaos. So Matsumoto clearly understood how to market spiritual ideas in a modern package. But he would offer things to the youth like, quote, improve your intelligence and achieve your life goals through ancient teachings, and claimed he could cure illnesses, relieve stress, and even bestow psychic powers with his methods. And if I was 13 years old, 14 years old, I would think that's pretty sick. Okay, especially if I saw it in a comic book. So, guy was kind of a genius in a really sick way. So in short, he was crafting a persona as a modern-day savior figure, blending science fiction, religion, and self-help. And it was just a recipe that proved alluring to many. So as his spiritual movement came together, Chizuo Matsumoto underwent a personal transformation that was symbolized by taking a new name. So sometime around 1986, he adopted the religious name Shoko Asahara. And in Japan, it's not uncommon for founders of religious groups to assume a holy name separate from their birth name. It just signals a rebirth into a spiritual role. And Shoko, associated with positive meanings like brightness, clarity, and happiness, had an enlightened ring to it, while Asahara was a surname he chose, perhaps simply for its pleasant sound or symbolic value. But by 1987, Matsumoto was exclusively known to his followers and to the media as Shoko Asahara. And it was just all part of constructing his guru persona. And now he just presented himself as a prophetic figure with a destiny. So he would project himself as a guru in the classic sense, growing out his hair and beard, wearing flowing robes of white and purple, and often posing in the lotus position on a cushioned throne. And he had studied how other cult leaders operated and was now applying those lessons. I've said this before and I'll say it again. I feel like all of them just read the same book and just follow the same steps. And clearly, that is what kind of happens. I feel like one cult leader happens and then one looks at that one and be like, okay, I'm going to change this. Maybe this will work. And then they apply it to the next one. And then that one dies or gets arrested. And then the next one's like, okay, that guy f***ed up there. This guy, I'm going to do this. And then Matsumoto was just like, I'm going to take all of that shit, put it in, and I'm going to fix it. I'm going to be the best. And newsflash, he wasn't. But Asahara, or Matsumoto, cultivated an image of benevolence and charisma. And he spoke gently in public, often smiling contentedly, and gave lectures about achieving happiness, health, and higher consciousness. But even at this early stage, some grandiosity shone through. And after returning from India, Asahara hinted that he had been recognized by overseas spiritual masters. He's getting recognized, guys. This is bad. And there's a story that in 1987, he visited a monastery in Tibet and was acknowledged as an enlightened being. Though this was likely embellished by Ohm's PR. I'm going to safely assume it probably never happened. And he also claimed to his followers that he was the reincarnation of prominent religious figures. Of course, at times even hinting he was Christ or the Lamb of God or the Hindu god Shiva in human form. He's just like, I'll take that one, that one, that one, and that one, and that one. He's like trying to character build, but you can't be all of them, okay? You're either a wood elf or you're a f***ing Khajiit, man. So he didn't always say this publicly in the 80s, but internally he let his flock know that he was a divine vessel. And they believed Asahara had achieved enlightenment and had psychic powers and could lead them to salvation. So the shy, bullied boy Chizuo Matsumoto was gone, and in his place stood Shoko Asahara, guru of supreme truth, the man who increasingly claimed to stand above mortals, on a mission to save the world, or so he preached. So Om Shinrikyo, as the world knows it, truly came into being in 1987. In that year, Shoko Asahara formally established Om Supreme Truth as a religious organization, building on the foundations of his earlier yoga group. And the transition from club to cult was marked by an expanding hierarchy and codified beliefs. Because initially, Om was headquartered in a cramped one-room apartment in Tokyo, as we know, but its ambitions were anything but small. And Asahara taught that Om represented the sacred sound of the universe, and Shinrikyo meant ultimate truth. But it signified that this was no mere meditation class, but the one path to enlightenment. So from the outset, Om Shinrikyo blended elements from various spiritual traditions. It was seemingly rooted in Buddhism, but Asahara incorporated Hindu concepts. The name Om itself is from Hindu mantra Om, and Taoist idea of energy, apocalyptic Christian visions, and even bits of science fiction thrown in there. So this eclectic doctrine just set it apart from more orthodox sects. Sects. That's the one I'm talking about. Sects. So in practice, early Om activities were an extension of Asahara's classes, and that involved yoga sessions, breathing exercises, and lectures on spiritual development. And members were taught that through Om's practices, they could purify themselves, gain spiritual powers, and ultimately attain salvation. And the organization also started publishing its own newsletters and magazines to spread its message, with Asahara's smiling face often on the cover. And a critical milestone came in August of 1989 when Om Shinrikyo achieved a legal recognition as a religious corporation under Japanese law, which is a big deal. Because after aggressive lobbying by Asahara and his team, including picketing government offices and wooing politicians, Tokyo's metropolitan government granted Om the official status of a religious organization. Sounds corrupt as f*** to me. But this was the turning point, because with this status, Om gained tax exemptions and, more importantly, a degree of immunity from any sort of investigation. Because Japanese law at the time, the religious corporations law, was very protective of religious freedom due to post-war sensitivities. So once a group was certified, authorities were hands-off regarding its internal affairs. So Asahara reportedly made obtaining this status a top priority because he knew it would be a protective shield for his activities. And experts later noted that after 1989, Om's character, quote, dramatically changed. Big shock. It just grew richer, bolder, and just more secretive. And at recognition, Om's net assets were around 430 million yen, and by 1995, they ballooned to over 100 billion yen, nearly 1 billion US dollars. And membership also exploded from maybe a few dozen core members into 1984 to 10,000 by 1992 to 50,000 worldwide by 1995. And those are rough numbers, but that's insane. Thus, by the end of the 1980s, Om Shinrikyo was no obscure cult. It was a fast-growing religious movement with official legitimacy. And it had also acquired property, attracted educated followers, and set up branches beyond Japan. And Shoko Asahara stood at the helm of this enterprise. Now, not just a guru, but the founder of a religion with all the deference and power that entailed. quick pause for those watching on video. Rupert disappeared from the background because he had to pee, so Daddy took him outside. All right, let's continue. So Aum Shinrikyo's early growth was driven by smart recruitment and appeal to Japan's educated elite. And unlike many cults, Aum targeted top university grads, scientists, engineers, and professionals just disillusioned with materialism. So a lot of smart people, but also a lot of smart, pretentious people. And in booming 1980s Japan, many young people felt spiritually empty. And Aum offered meaning, adventure, and promises of superhuman abilities. And recruiters distributed flyers at campuses and bookstores, ran yoga centers offering free classes, and built trust through relatable young staff. So just all the perfect building blocks for an almost perfect cult. I don't even like calling it a perfect cult because cults are not perfect. They're very flawed and horrible, but you know what I mean. They had a system and it worked. And they also promised self-improvement, healing, and heightened intelligence through Aum's teachings. And as mentioned earlier, Aum used pop culture tools to hook anime and sci-fi fans as well. And these included manga and animated videos showing Asahara as a cosmic hero, like a really up Superman. And those who showed interest and could pay, obviously, were invited to intense initiation rituals and advanced courses. And these included harsh ascetic practices like upside-down yoga and possibly LSD-fueled visions framed as spiritual cleansing. Because like the CIA, and if you didn't go watch my MK Ultra video, you should probably watch that, but if you get people that aren't in the right mindset, aka on drugs, they're kinda easier to manipulate. And by 1989, Aum had expanded beyond Japan, sending emissaries to Russia after the Soviet collapse to tap into the spiritual vacuum. And in the early 90s, Asahara preached in Moscow to crowds of 10 to 15,000 people and set up branches, gaining significant Russian followings. And Aum also opened small branches in the US and Germany, targeting New Age seekers. And in Japan, Aum bought properties for communal living and training, and most notably the massive Kallmekris compound near Mount Fuji. That took me way more than once to pronounce, so I'm sorry if I didn't do it right. But hundreds lived there under Asahara's direct rule, in less than ideal conditions designed for total control. And this separation from society enabled Aum to tighten its grip on members and conceal illegal activities. And by the late 80s, Aum had transformed into a large, international cult with thousands of followers, promising spiritual enlightenment and grand cosmic purpose. But behind the scenes, Asahara's leadership was consolidating control, laying groundwork for extreme actions that would follow. So in the late 1980s, life in Aum Shinrikyo outwardly appeared to center on disciplined spiritual practice. And new members were gradually immersed in Aum's specialized path, which is hours of yoga, meditation, mantra chanting, and recitation of Buddhist sutras. Asahara laid out a progression from lay seminar attendees to full renunciants who gave up jobs and family to live in the Aum communes. So again, just separating them from families, isolating them in a certain place and saying like, I need all your stuff. Like that's just, I need all your money. It's just the makings of the quintessential cult. And those who renounced the world wore monastic style clothing and took new spiritual names. And Aum preached self-denial and demanded obedience. So members were too detached from worldly ties, especially money and family. And many gave all of their savings to Aum or pressured their families into donating, believing it led to spiritual liberation, aka bullshit. And communal life meant strict diets, fasting, and sleep deprivation, both for spiritual reasons and to increase suggestibility. And this is when extreme rituals would emerge, some of which were cold water endurance tests, prolonged isolation, and bizarre practices like the quote, perfect salvation initiation hats with electrical wires. So they were literally hats with wires in them. And the PSIs supposedly helped align members' brainwaves with Asahara, which, again, just bullshit. And members also consumed small amounts of liquid allegedly containing Asahara's blood or bathwater, I choose none, and sold as sacred substances to purify the spirit. Guy was a sadist, and he also just wanted everyone to see his body as holy. Have we ever heard that before, children? Anybody that grew up in the Catholic or even Christian church? Body of Christ. You eat the cracker. That's the body of Christ. He's taken that little right out of the Catholic teachings. Basically just a really unoriginal guy, if you ask me. But most followers didn't know these details, but all lived under strict control anyways. And leaving the compound or faith was nearly impossible. And in public, Asahara presented as Om as peaceful. It was just monks meditating and followers healing illnesses through spiritual power, and himself as a miracle worker. And Om operated yoga centers and clinics that recruited members and brought in money. It's fine. Everything's fine. Don't talk about the cold water torture or, the brainwave hats. So life in Om blended real spiritual devotion with growing authoritarianism. And for members, daily life meant communal living, devotion to Asahara, and cutting ties with the outside world, all in pursuit of, say it together, salvation. And they believed they were finding peace, unaware their obedience and isolation would later fuel Om's descent into fanaticism, and honestly just psychosis. And even then, the seeds were planted, because we had blind faith, endurance of hardship, and belief that the ends justified the means. So as the 1990s began, Shoko Asahara's teachings turned increasingly apocalyptic. Just the natural order of cults. Because in the late 80s, Om focused on personal enlightenment, but after gaining religious status, Asahara introduced global catastrophe prophecies. Because what better technique than to scare everyone that already trusts you into making sure you're the only one that they trust. And he combined elements from Revelation, Nostradamus, Hinduism, and Buddhism to frame Om as central to humanity's fate. And in 1989, he published The Destruction of the World, predicting escalating disasters ending in a US-Japan nuclear war in the late 90s. And these prophecies just tapped into that already growing Cold War fears and Nostradamus mania, claiming only Om followers would survive and rebuild. Because I know we all are like, I wouldn't fall for this. This is crazy. But shit was different back then. You had the Cold War. You had so much. I mean, I don't trust anybody now, especially with what's going on right now with government and everything. It's absolutely crazy. I think, be as skeptical as you can and ask questions. But back then, it was even more so like shit was hitting the fan in all types of ways. So people were scared and they needed and wanted someone to trust. And unfortunately, a lot of people put it in Asahara. So by 1991 and 1992, Asahara declared himself, quote, Christ and the Lamb of God and the Savior of this century. What a humble guy. Just a humble little guy, humble pie guy. And in declaring myself the Christ, he claimed to be Shiva, the destroyer god, implying divine duty to purify the world through destruction. And this shift in doctrine was partly sincere and partly a reaction to public criticism and political failure, because Asahara cast the outside world as corrupt and spiritually low, and also filled with conspiracies and evil vibrations. So Om's mission, he preached, was to save the worthy and usher in transformation. So he introduced a twisted version of Poa from Tibetan Buddhism. And there was the idea that killing someone full of bad karma could save their soul. See where we're going here? Bad path right now. So murder, in Om's logic, became an act of mercy or spiritual duty. And insiders would later say that Asahara's Buddhist knowledge was actually really shallow. Shocker. And ghostwriters compiled his teachings from various sources, but still, followers treated his books as sacred scripture, and the doctrine grew increasingly paranoid. Asahara claimed Freemasons, and Jews, and others were attacking Om with poison gas. And in Shivering Predictions in 1993, Asahara warned of nuclear devastation in Japan between 1996 and 1998, claiming 90% of the population would die, which is a horrible, massive allegation and conspiracy to put out there. And he pledged his religious credibility on this, saying a third world war will break out in 1997. Newsflash, it didn't. And he wasn't being symbolic either. Asahara meant these claims literally, and followers believed him. So between 1989 and 1992, Ohm's focus shifted from spiritual growth to doomsday ideology, and Asahara cast himself as a divine savior and encouraged followers to abandon conventional morality. So the groundwork was laid. If only Ohm could save the world, then violence could be justified as sacred. Sounds like a serial killer to me. So during this period, Aum Shinrikyo's internal structure grew more complex and authoritarian. So it began as a loose commune solidified into a hierarchical organization with ministries and ranks. And Asahara stood firmly at the top as the absolute leader. You know, like a dictator? I don't know. And directly under him was an inner circle of trusted lieutenants, many with specific expertise like science, medicine, finance, etc. And a formal cabinet was created mimicking a government. So for example, Ohm had a minister of science and technology, and a minister of health, and even a minister of intelligence who ran the cult's spy operations. Yeah, what? And this just gave Ohm a quasi-state identity, as if they were not just a religion, but a government in waiting for a post-apocalyptic world that they envisioned themselves. So regular followers were just thrown into initiates, monks, and so on. And they were encouraged to surrender all autonomy. And one of Asahara's decrees was that true seekers must, quote, abandon their egos. I think you should start following your own rules, because that's crazy to say that to people when you're doing all this shit. You're doing the most for your ego. And in practice, that meant meaning obey every order without question. So the system of control included constant monitoring. Senior disciples oversaw juniors and would report any doubts or rule breaking. Another layer of structure was cell-like units for operations. And as Ohm started engaging in secret projects like arms production and chemical experiments, they compartmentalized knowledge. And only select teams knew about these illicit endeavors, and they were kept hidden from a majority of members who genuinely thought Ohm was purely a spiritual group. So a lot of people didn't really know what was going on behind the scenes. So it's like, you know, you're like, how could you follow somebody so corrupt and horrible? They didn't know. A lot of the people that followed just thought it was a spiritual group doing yoga and being nice to everyone and just like having some spirituality and everything. And meanwhile, it was a whole tyrannical government just psyop. So this internal compartmentalization meant that organization could present a benign face, with many members just oblivious to the crime, while a core group executed Asahara's darker plans. And Asahara himself fostered a godlike distance from all of it. So he just had like little minions doing his evil work. And by the early 90s, he was often in seclusion, emerging mainly to give sermons or meet important followers. And ordinary devotees rarely got personal access to him anymore. So they just had to revere him from afar via videos or hearing his voice over loudspeakers. Did you guys watch my Jim Jones video? He did that too. So this just created a cult of personality so strong that even if he demanded the unthinkable, there were those in his inner circle willing to carry it out no matter what. In essence, by 1992, Aum Shinrikyo had morphed into a high-control cult. A rigid hierarchy with Asahara as an infallible leader, a bureaucratic structure to implement his will, and mechanisms of fear, propaganda, and secrecy to maintain order. And this structure was so primed to undertake radical actions because the usual checks, such as internal debate, moral hesitation, or external oversight, had been eliminated by design. This guy was playing the longest of long games. And though Aum Shinrikyo publicly preached peace, signs of hidden violence emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And a pivotal event was the November 1989 murder of lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto, who was preparing a class action lawsuit against Aum. So a Japanese TV station interviewed Sakamoto in October of 1989, but secretly showed the tape to Aum before airing, alerting the cult. And this just enraged Asahara's inner circle, and they decided to eliminate him. So on November 5th, 1989, senior Aum members broke into Sakamoto's home with potassium chloride-filled syringes. And they would bludgeon and then inject Sakamoto and his wife, Satoko, and their 14-month-old son, Tatsuhiko, then strangle strangled them all to death. And the bodies were then hidden in metal drums and then buried. But after they were deceased and before they were buried, they would take out their teeth and smash them. And the bedding was also burned to destroy evidence. So the family just vanished without a trace. And Ohm denied involvement, and the case remained unsolved until members confessed in 1995. Just absolutely monster evil. The evilest of evil. And the murders marked Ohm's first external act of brutality and just emboldened them when they faced no consequences. So internally, it just reinforced Asahara's belief that their mission was divinely protected. And Ohm also began targeting outside critics. And cartoonist Yoshinori Kobayashi was added to an assassination list after mocking the cult in manga. And in 1993, Ohm attempted to attack him, but he survived luckily. But the details remain unclear. And Ohm would escalate surveillance by 1990 to 1991, wiretapping enemies and disguising members as NTT technicians to bug phone lines. And this level of espionage was unprecedented for a religious group in Japan. It was just absolutely insane. Like, this is what the CIA does. And in 1990, Asahara and 24 Ohm followers ran for office under the, quote, Supreme Truth Party, aiming to gain political power. There was just no stopping this group. And Asahara hoped to become prime minister, but all candidates lost. Badly, I might add. Thank God. Because he received only 1,700 votes out of 500,000. I don't know math well, but that's really bad. So the humiliation just deepened when it appeared even Ohm members didn't all vote for him. Because remember, there is a lot of Ohm members at this point. We're in the tens of thousands. So the election loss just radicalized this cult. And feeling rejected by society, Ohm's focus shifted to apocalyptic teachings and just straight paranoia. So Asahara's sermons turned toward vision of Armageddon, like we were talking about, and persecution. And the group abandoned any attempt to integrate into normal society. And by 1992, Ohm had become a violent, paranoid Doomsday cult, just fitting right in there with the rest. Because it secretly murdered critics and descendants, plotted future attacks, and saw itself as waging a holy war against the outside world. So the fuse was lit. And Asahara's talk of destroying the world was no longer theoretical, because plans were already taking shape beneath the surface. So the shadowy crimes of Aum Shinrikyo began to mount as the cult silenced enemies and hid the evidence. The Sakamoto family murder in 1989 was the cult's first major crime and textbook cover-up that we know of. And nearly 6 years after that, Tetsumi Sakamoto's disappearance remained unsolved, thanks to Ohm's meticulous cover-up. And in the early 90s, Ohm carried out other targeted killings. Some likely victims included descendant cultists and hostile outsiders. And there was talk of Ohm planning to assassinate leaders of rival Buddhist movements, like Soko Gakkai's president, but they ultimately did not go through with it. And a new religion called Happy Science. They had actually drawn up assassination lists naming such individuals as enemies of truth. And the attempted murder of manga artist Yoshinori Kobayashi in 1993, mentioned earlier, was also in relation to this list. And one heartless crime was the February 1995 abduction and murder of Kiyoshi Kariya. Now, Kariya was not an Ohm member, but the brother of one. And a sister was a wealthy woman who had fled Ohm, and the cult desperately wanted to find her and her money. So in February of 1995, a team of Ohm operatives kidnapped Kariya and brought him to their compound. And they tried to force him to reveal his sister's location because they wanted her back in the cult. But he resisted, and perhaps he just actually didn't know. And in that process of trying to convince him to tell them, they fatally overdosed him with an anesthetic. And Kariya died in their custody. And the cult would then incinerate his body in a furnace within their complex and dump the remains so that he simply vanished like the others. However, unlike Sakamoto's case, this crime would unravel quickly, and by early March of 1995, Kariya's disappearance was under investigation and suspicion was creeping toward Ohm. a crucial factor that Asahara sensed, which just pushed him toward desperate measures. And by 1994, numerous families of Ohm members and a coalition of lawyers were vocally accusing Ohm of kidnapping and violence. So there was smoke, but authorities were slow to act decisively. Partly out of caution dealing with a religion, fearful of repeating past mistakes of suppressing religious groups, and partly because Ohm aggressively threatened those who opposed them. It was like a known thing. For example, anti-cult meetings were often infiltrated by Ohm spies or distributed by intimidating phone calls. These guys were everywhere. So from 1989 to 1994, Ohm Shinrikyo had already become a murder machine on a small scale, but it just treated human life as expendable in service of Asahara's will. It didn't matter whether it was traitors, spies, or innocent bystanders like the Sakamoto baby. Each killing was carefully hidden with technology and deception, which in turn gave Asahara and his henchmen confidence to escalate further without immediate consequence. So the cult was now rehearsing the very tactics of fear and lethal force that would later shock the world on a much, much grander scale. So inside Ohm's sheltered world, discipline could be deadly. And the atmosphere by the early 90s had turned Orwellian. If you get that reference, you're a smart little cookie. If you don't get that reference, it's like dystopian and f***ed up. But everyone was encouraged to report on each other in the name of spiritual correction. And the smallest doubt in Asahara's teachings was seen as an impurity to be purged. And Asahara established a sort of Inquisition within a cult, and members suspected of disloyalty, wavering faith, or even those who failed to devote enough assets were subjected to harsh punishment. And dissent was not tolerated. You could not leave this cult without repercussions. And if someone criticized Asahara or a policy, they would at best be subjected to intensive training, which is solitary confinement or exhausting physical exercise. And at the very worst, you'd just disappear from existence. So a climate of fear began to permeate the higher echelons of this cult. And some of the earliest known murders happened in 1989 and 1990, targeting those who threatened Asahara's authority. And in February 1989, member Shuji Taguchi tried to leave and was killed on Asahara's order to keep him silent. And the murder was hidden, but showed that by 1989, and Ohm was enforcing loyalty through violence. And another case involved Kotaro Ochida, a young member allegedly killed around 1990 for attempting to leave the faith or for disobedience. And these internal murders served dual purposes. First, they removed perceived threats and also acted as warnings to other members. And if word got around, even in rumor, that, quote, so-and-so left and something bad happened to them, it just instilled fear and it ensured compliance. So even those who might have had second thoughts just stayed because they were absolutely terrified. So it was just an extreme form of coercive control. And Asahara justified such brutality with spiritual jargon, spiritual bullshit. And he claimed that those who betrayed the mission had accumulated terrible karma and were going to hell anyway, so killing them was actually releasing them from their sins. Oh, is that right? You fucking bitch. Just absolutely sick and appalling. But followers conditioned by years of teachings often accepted this twisted logic, and some who carried out killings later said they believed they were not doing murder, but liberation by Poa. And Ohm's training regime often crossed into physical extremity because members were hung upside down or subjected to water immersion and other grueling practices under the guise of purification. So, torture, basically. And at least one follower died during a dehydration training exercise in the late 80s. And authorities later found chemical vats and human remains in Ohm facilities, suggesting attempts to erase evidence of such deaths. And these events just demonstrate how thoroughly Asahara's cult had subverted the fundamental moral code. Because the commandment, quote, "thou shalt not kill," was effectively null inside Ohm. Just didn't apply. He took a couple other things, but just didn't take, one of the most important commandments there is. So he took that quote and just replaced it with, "thou shalt not defy Asahara." So if any individual's existence, whether through potential betrayal or simply lack of fit, threatened Asahara's vision, that individual's life was forfeit in his eyes. So the normal emotional barriers to harming one's peers had been eroded by years of indoctrination and the climate of fear. And it's worth noting, not all OM members were aware of these extreme measures. In fact, I'm assuming most of them weren't aware, because most lower-level members still believed the worst that might happen for disobedience was expulsion or stern discipline. But the inner circle, however, had crossed the point of no return, and they kept those secrets compartmentalized. And this means a portion of OM's population remained idealistic and just blissfully unaware, providing a facade of normalcy, while a core was essentially running a cultic secret police and death squad. So Aum Shinrikyo had become its own totalitarian microstate, with Asahara as an absolute ruler who could and did eliminate subordinates at will. And this just set the stage for what was to come next, because the cult turned its perfected brutality outward on a much larger scale. So while secretly committing murders, Aum Shinrikyo also launched a large-scale weapons of mass destruction program, driven by Asahara's obsession with Armageddon. And in 1990, Aum began culturing anthrax bacteria specifically. And in 1993, they attempted a bio-attack by spraying anthrax from their Tokyo HQ rooftop. But the strain used was non-virulent, resulting only in foul odors and complaints. No infections, thank goodness. So Asahara then pursued Ebola, sending members to Zaire in 1992 under the guise of charity, but likely failed to obtain a live sample. Like, they were ready to put out one of the most deadly diseases out into the public to make a point. Just fucking disgusting and horrifying. But Aum's real, quote, success came with chemical weapons, because in 1993, they built a sarin production lab at their compound, and it was led by Masami Tsuchiya, a top chemist. Because remember, they had a bunch of top chemists and scientists and people in politics and everything, so they had a guy for this. And they produced sarin, VX, somen, and mustard gas, aiming for industrial scale capacity. And though the full plant wasn't complete, by late 1993, they had enough sarin for field testing. So in 1994, they tested sarin on 29 sheep at Banjaran Station, a ranch in Western Australia. But authorities didn't identify Aum at the time, and the incident was just treated as a mysterious poisoning. So encouraged by this proof of concept, Aum ramped up sarin production in early 1995. And police raids later uncovered enough chemicals to potentially kill millions of people, which is so scary, because by 1995, Aum had already produced several dozen kilograms and still held sufficient precursors to make more. And they also had 200 grams of VX, which they used in covert assassinations in 1994. And VX is an extremely poisonous synthetic chemical classified as a nerve agent, and it is considered one of the most toxic and rapid-acting to the known chemical warfare agents. So Tadahito Yamaguchi, suspected of being a spy, was killed by VX swabbed on his neck. And this was the first known VX murder in history. And 2 other VX attacks left victims in comas or severely injured. And Aum also tried to produce AK-74 rifles, building a secret factory and making a few working prototypes. And they aimed to produce 1,000 guns, but only completed a handful by 1995. So not only did they have like a CIA agent within the cult/religious group, they also had a f***ing army going on. A secret army bioterrorist biochemical group. I don't know. Just a horrifying mix. And Aum reportedly bought at least 1 military helicopter from Russia, likely to disperse chemicals by air, which again, f***ing terrifying. And by 1994, Aum had transformed into a WMD producing cult with near 1 billion in assets and highly skilled member scientists. And the religious cover and remote compound allowed these activities to go completely unnoticed. How is this allowed? And Asahara's apocalyptic vision just fueled the weapons buildup, because he believed Aum must survive and possibly trigger the end times. So Aum's arsenal was intended not just for defense, but to wage a final war and rise from the ruins as rulers of the new world. Just bullshit. But by 1995, Aum Shinrikyo had crossed the line from cult to fully armed terrorist group, just ready to unleash mass destruction. So on a warm summer night in 1994, Aum Shinrikyo's campaign of terror moved from theory to reality in the city of Matsumoto. And Matsumoto is a tranquil castle town in Nagano Prefecture. But on June 27th, 1994, it became the testing ground for Aum's newly produced sarin nerve gas. So at around 10:40 p.m., as residents were winding down for the night, cult operatives put into action a plan to assassinate 3 judges who were overseeing a lawsuit unfavorable to Aum. And the judges lived in an apartment complex in Matsumoto. And Aum's team would load up a converted refrigeration truck with a custom-built device, which was a heater to vaporize liquid sarin and fans to disperse it as an aerosol cloud. So it'd be nearly indetectable. So parking it near the target building, they released the gas, which formed an invisible deadly mist drifting through the neighborhood. And soon, people in the area began having bizarre symptoms, such as pinpoint pupils, which was a classic sign of nerve agent poisoning, difficulty breathing, nausea, and vision problems. And frantic calls to emergency services began around 11:30 p.m., with reports of residents found convulsing and unconscious. And paramedics arriving on the scene were just perplexed by what was going on, because it seemed like a mass poisoning, but by what? And people described smelling something unusual. Some said it was like pesticides. But by the next morning, the toll became clear, and 7 people died from the sarin exposure, and some 200 to 300 others were injured. And among the dead were not only 2 of the intended judges, but also random residents. And another victim, Sumiko Kono, fell into a coma and never recovered, passing away 14 years later, bringing the eventual death count to 8. So the Matsumoto sarin attack was unprecedented. It was a chemical weapon unleashed on civilians in peacetime. But at the time, Japanese authorities didn't know who did it, and investigators noticed dead fish in the vicinity, and chemical analysis identified the toxin as sarin. But it was beyond comprehension that a domestic group could produce such a thing, and suspicion initially did not fall squarely on Aum. In fact, one unfortunate local man named Yoshiyuki Kono, who happened to have a chemistry background and some pesticides at home, was eyed as a suspect by police and media. But he was later, obviously, exonerated, but not before his reputation was completely ruined. And though many expressed their public apologies to him, the attack remained a mystery for months. And Aum members knew, at least the team involved did, but they maintained total silence. And from Aum's perspective, Matsumoto served 2 purposes. It was revenge/preemption against the judges. Indeed, the judges were incapacitated and couldn't deliver a ruling against Aum. And it was proof of concept for mass murder by nerve gas. And as cruel as it sounds, Matsumoto was likely seen by Asahara's inner circle as an experiment. Just a mere little experiment that took 8 lives and injured hundreds of others. And it was also, quote, useful to see how effective sarin could be in an open environment and how authorities would respond. So when they essentially got away with it, no arrest and public confusion about the perpetrator, they were further emboldened again. And after Matsumoto, Asahara reportedly became convinced that more dramatic violence was not only feasible, but necessary. And in retrospect, the Matsumoto sarin attack was the final step before Aum's grand act of terror in Tokyo. And it signaled that Aum had crossed into outright terrorism, and it provided them with data and confidence to carry out an even larger attack. One that Asahara believed might trigger the apocalyptic war he both feared and sought. So as 1994 turned into 1995, Shoko Asahara became convinced that Armageddon was imminent and drastic action was very necessary. And police suspicions after the Matsumoto attack and the February 95 disappearance of Kiyoshi Kariya indicated to Asahara that raids were coming. So authorities planned large-scale raids on Aum for late March, prompting Asahara to push for action. So inside Aum, activity just intensified and everything needed to move quicker. And Asahara told followers the world's end was coming really quick. and any police move was the beginning of the prophesized persecution, and he believed chaos must be unleashed to fulfill prophecy and prevent Ohm's destruction. So Asahara rationalized an offensive terror attack as a divine preemptive salvation, and potentially the trigger for the global war. So as mentioned, in early 1995, Ohm increased sarin production and prepared hydrogen cyanide devices for mass attacks. And other preparations were also included, including alleged chemical booby traps in compounds, though there are no reports that any were actually triggered, gas masks, hazmat suits, and even a helicopter potentially for chemical dispersal. And there were even training drills with umbrella point sarin delivery. So there was sarin at the tip of umbrella points to poke people, basically, to poison them. So Asahara cited prophecy and warned of US chemical nuclear attacks. And he framed mass murder as a holy act, a necessary purification. Believing they were executing divine will, followers accepted the need for violence. So Asahara and his inner circle decided to release sarin in Tokyo's subway system. And their goals were as follows: create chaos to delay or prevent the impending raids, and possibly spark the apocalyptic war that Asahara predicted. So it was just a desperate, delusional gamble with Ohm cornered and lashing out. So Asahara handpicked a team of loyal scientists and medics for the operation, and the date was chosen, and it was March 20th, 1995, just ahead of the scheduled raids. And in the final days, perpetrators meditated and chanted, seeing their act as sacred duty. And vehicles, sarin packets, umbrellas, and escape routes were all prepared with precision. And Aum Shinrikyo had completed its path to terrorism, ready to unleash unprecedented violence. And during all of this planning, in early 1995, authorities were preparing a massive raid on Aum, scheduled for March 22nd. And this attack was scheduled for March 20th. And Asahara, tipped off by informants, believed Aum's survival was at stake. So he saw the sarin attack as the last-ditch move to paralyze or deter police action. So Monday, March 20th, 1995, began like any other busy day in Tokyo. Millions of commuters packed into trains bound for the city center. And unbeknownst to them, 5 of those commuters were Aum Shinrikyo's operatives carrying a deadly mission in their bags. And in the pre-dawn hours, these men had assembled at Aum's Tokyo office to prepare packets of liquid sarin, each wrapped in newspaper and contained in plastic bags. So each man carried 2 such packets, along with sharpened umbrellas to serve as a puncturing tool. And the plan was meticulously drawn. They would board specific trains on 3 major subway lines that all converged at Gosumakaseki Station, which was the literal heart of Tokyo's government district, home of many ministry offices. So by targeting trains arriving there around 8 a.m., they aimed to inflict maximum casualties among government workers and create chaos at the seat of power. So at approximately 7:45 a.m., the operatives boarded their assigned trains on the Hibiya, Morinochi, and Chiyoda lines. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. I'm very, very sorry. And then they would split up. So Dr. Ikuo Hayashi and one accomplice got on the Chiyoda line, and Kenichi Hirose on the other line. And then Toru Toyota was on another line, and Masato Yokoyama on a Hibiya line train. So they were all dispersing separately. And Yasuo Hayashi, the last person, was on the second Hibiya line on that train. So each knew exactly when to act and where to get off to escape. And as their trains neared central Tokyo, they set the attack in motion. And on each train car, the Aum member placed the bags of sarin on the floor, typically near the door or under a seat. And then, using the umbrella's sharpened tip, they pierced the bags. Some of them punctured both packets, and some only managed one if they were hurried. But immediately, liquid sarin began to spill out onto the floor. And sarin is volatile, quickly evaporating into gas. And because it's odorless and colorless, passengers didn't realize anything was wrong until symptoms hit. So the operatives pierced the bags and then exited the trains as pre-planned, leaving behind the leaking packages. And within minutes, those subway cars turned into hellish chambers. And commuters started coughing uncontrollably, their vision blurred, and eyes and noses started to run. And many collapsed as a nerve agent disrupted their nervous systems, because sarin blocks neurotransmitters, causing muscles to seize and organs to literally fail. So people began foaming at the mouth, vomiting and writhing in seizures on the train floors. And at subsequent stations, some conductors, not understanding the full scope, opened doors to get victims out, inadvertently allowing the fumes to spread into the stations. And on one train, a station staff member named Kazumasa Takahashi, a station master, heroically tried to pick up a leaking sarin bag with his bare hands to remove it, but he would collapse and die very shortly after. But many frontline metro staff like him suffered as they tried to help passengers, not knowing what they were dealing with. But the coordination of the Ohm terrorists was precise. And 5 different trains were hit nearly simultaneously, sowing confusion across multiple lines. And some trains were stopped mid-route when people started collapsing, and others made it to terminals with dozens of unconscious passengers on board. And by about 8:10 and 8:15 a.m., emergency calls flooded in from multiple stations, because people were lying on platforms, unable to breathe, and something was just severely wrong, but no one knew what. And initially, responders thought it might be a gas leak or accidental poisoning, but soon the sheer scale across locations indicated a deliberate attack. And the affected stations span a broad swath of central Tokyo, just amplifying the panic. And the perpetrators by then had regrouped and were heading back to Ohm's compound, or to safe houses. Meanwhile, people were confused and suffering back in Tokyo. So the immediate aftermath of the subway attack was one of chaos and heroism, because commuters and subway staff, unaware of the exact nature of the threat, nonetheless acted to help one another. And many victims stumbled out of the subway exits onto the streets of Tokyo's business district, eyes blinking and tearing, some collapsing right outside the stations. And passerby and onlookers at the street level were confronted with scenes of people lying on the sidewalks, suits just askew, gasping for air or unconscious. And the first emergency medics arriving also got sick, because some had not realized a nerve agent was present and lacked protective gear. But quickly, doctors in emergency rooms noticed telltale signs of nerve agent poisoning, and hospitals across Tokyo were soon overwhelmed. In total, over 5,500 people were affected, and these ranged from critical cases to those with milder exposure. And many came in on their own, worried after experiencing blurred vision or any sort of nausea. But the hardest hit were the commuters in the immediate vicinity of the sarin packages and the station workers who handled them. And the attack killed a total of 13 people on that day. And later, some sources count 14, including one who died later. And among the dead were subway employees like Mr. Takahashi and just ordinary riders. And hundreds more were left with serious injuries. Some were in comas for days, and others suffered permanent nerve damage or lung damage. And some victims even lost their eyesight almost completely due to the nerve agent's effect. And the station, in a whole, being under government offices, saw high casualties among the bureaucracy, and it had to be completely shut down and decontaminated. And uniformed police officers with gas masks swarmed stations and sealed off entrances. And Tokyo's morning rush, usually the perfect example of order, turned into a disaster zone. And sirens blared through central Tokyo as ambulances raced victims to dozens of hospitals. So the scale of the incident led to the largest mobilization of emergency services Japan had seen since perhaps World War II. And the public reaction initially was confusion and obvious, utter terror, because no one had claimed responsibility immediately, and the idea that a Japanese cult had done this was not yet confirmed the first day. Because most people feared it might be international terrorism or some deranged lone wolf, but suspicion quickly gravitated towards Aum Shinrikyo within hours, especially among authorities who connected the dots, because they recalled the Matsumoto case and that Aum had a chemist. So by the next day, March 21st, the police publicly announced Aum as the focus of investigation. And in the broader public, once Aum's responsibility was clear, there was a mix of anger, fear, and just bewilderment. Because how could a homegrown religious group commit such an atrocity? I know, a lot do. They're called cults. I mean, it's just terrible to think about, but it's actually insane how one person can just rise up and garner this following and make them into like brainwashed slaves, just taking advantage of them and then inflict such pain on their own country. It's just it's horrifying to think about. I keep saying it, but it really is. And the attack just shattered Japan's self-image as a safe, orderly society. And people suddenly felt vulnerable in everyday situations. And ridership on subways dropped for a time as commuters were obviously fearful. And sales of personal protective devices spiked drastically. And the media ran 24/7 coverage of Ohm, interviewing ex-members, experts on cults, and victims and families. And internationally, the Tokyo subway sarin attack was a wake-up call about the threat of weapons of mass destruction terrorism. Because this was the deadliest terrorist attack in Japan's modern history and one of the worst acts of chemical terrorism just ever. So governments around the world took notice. And emergency response protocols for chemical attacks were reevaluated in many countries. And Japan's own self-reflection led to changes in how law enforcement monitors extremist groups. Thank God. So as details emerged about Aum Shinrikyo's doomsday ideology and mass murder, Japan was gripped by shock, grief, and just a deep sense of betrayal. And candlelight visuals were held, newspapers demanded justice, and TV programs showcased former cult members exposing Ohm's inner horrors. And authorities responded swiftly. And on March 22nd, 1995, like they planned, over 2,500 police raided 25 Ohm facilities nationwide. And the Prime Minister would actually address the nation, vowing zero tolerance for terrorism. And legal action followed, but Japan's strong protections for religious freedom sparked debate on how to proceed. And rather than immediately banning Ohm under the anti-subversive activities law, authorities targeted it through arrests, asset freezes, and pressure. And in October of 1995, the Tokyo District Court formally dissolved Ohm as a religious corporation. Thank God, stripping its status legally. So Ohm's assets were liquidated through bankruptcy to compensate victims. And in 1999, Japan passed the Organization Control Act, enabling surveillance of groups like Ohm that had committed mass murder. And the law ensured that Ohm's successor groups remained under constant monitoring. And public anger just intensified over missed warnings, including the 1989 Sakamoto case and ignored family complaints. And the media also faced scrutiny. Specifically, the Tokyo Broadcasting System was condemned for secretly showing Sakamoto's interview tape to Ohm in 1989, a move that likely led to his murder. And the scandal led to resignations at TBS and spurred reflection on media ethics. And by late 1995, attention shifted to the courtroom as Japan prepared for Asahara's trial of the century. And the subway attack sparked one of the most unified national responses in Japanese history. And police crackdowns, legal reforms, and media accountability reshaped how Japan approached domestic threats. So after the Tokyo subway attack, Japanese law enforcement acted swiftly, rounding up hundreds of Aum Shinrikyo members. But the key target, Shoko Asahara, prompting a national and global manhunt. But unknown to police, Asahara had never left Ohm's compound. He was actually hiding in a custom-built, soundproof chamber inside Station Number 6, a warehouse on the compound. And the chamber was cramped, dark, and hidden between floors, and only a few close aides knew about it. So when police raided the compound on March 22nd, they uncovered labs and weapons, arresting many but missing Asahara. So investigators continued dismantling the compound and interrogating followers, gradually piecing together clues. And on May 16, 1995, nearly 2 months after the attack, police drilled into Station Number 6 and found Asahara in his weak, stupid, dark, cramped little piece of shit hiding spot, just lying silently in meditation, as if he didn't have a care in the world for all the fucked up stuff that he had done. And they found him unkempt, dressed in his robe, and offered no resistance. And the surreal arrest scene was broadcast on TV, crowds watching as police pulled him out of this crawl space and into custody. And his arrest was seen as the breaking point because the mastermind was no longer free. And throughout 1995, authorities captured dozens of Ohm's key figures. And one exception was Hideo Murai, the cult's science minister, who was fatally stabbed by a Yakuza member on live TV in April of 1995. And others, along with the 5 subway attackers, were arrested in late 1996. But some of the other terrorists that committed some of the other terrorist attacks other than Tokyo's weren't arrested until 2012. But with Asahara imprisoned and silent, Ohm's structure just completely collapsed. And some diehard followers tried minor retaliatory acts, like sending a parcel bomb to a Tokyo governor's office in 1995, but the cult without Asahara's leadership and amid public outrage just disintegrated. And his arrest marked the end of Om Shinrikyo's violent era and the beginning of a complex legal reckoning. And this reckoning for Shoko Asahara and his Om Shinrikyo followers spanned over a decade, becoming one of Japan's longest and most complex trials. So Asahara was indicted on 17 charges, including murder and kidnapping related to the Tokyo subway and Matsumoto sarin attacks, also the Sakamoto family murders, and more. And his trial would begin in April of 1996 in a specially secured Tokyo courtroom. And at first, Asahara spoke at length, offering rambling explanations and partial denials, blaming some actions on overzealous followers, as if it wasn't all his idea. But over time, he would become withdrawn, just pretending to meditate, ignoring questions, or mumbling incoherently. And his mental state was questioned, obviously, but after evaluation, he was ruled completely competent. And many believed he was feigning symptoms to just stall the trial, which I would not put it past him. And victims and bereaved families gave emotional testimony about Om's devastation. And former members, including key perpetrators, testified that they had acted under Asahara's command. And their insider accounts were crucial in proving his authority and responsibility in everything. And the trial lasted over 7 years with hundreds of sessions. But in February of 2004, Asahara was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. And judges called Om's crimes unprecedentedly heinous and held Asahara fully responsible for orchestrating mass murder through his total control over followers. And Asahara obviously appealed by default, but had fired his lawyers and remained silent, giving no help to his defense. And the Tokyo High Court rejected the appeal in 2006, thank goodness. And a final plea to the Supreme Court claiming mental unfitness was dismissed that September, and his sentence was finalized. And meanwhile, over 190 Om members were indicted and tried in parallel, and many received sentences from a few years to life imprisonment. And a dozen senior members, including sarin attackers and planners, were also sentenced to death. And appeals were exhausted by the mid-2000s for nearly all of them. But Hayashi, who released the most sarin, showed remorse, but was still sentenced to death. You can't really say sorry after you killed people. And the doctor was spared execution for his early confession and remorse, but he would receive life imprisonment. So by 2006, all major trials were complete. 13 death sentences, many life terms, and hundreds convicted of lesser offenses. And as for Asahara, he would remain on death row until 2018, largely unresponsive and isolated in the Tokyo Detention Center. But the very final trial ended in January of 2018, clearing the way for executions. Beyond criminal trials, civil suits were filed for victim compensation, and a court-managed trust liquidated Om's assets, distributing roughly $1.5 billion, which is about $14 million US, to victims. And though restitution obviously couldn't undo the damage, it offered some relief. By 2018, the legal saga ended definitively. 190 convicted, 30 executed, Om's leadership dismantled. Japan affirmed that no ideology, religious or otherwise, could justify such crimes, and justice had been served, even if healing was still ongoing. And the nation moved forward, carrying with it the hard-earned lessons of Om's dark legacy. And that is Om Shinrikyo, the deep dive. You guys have been asking me to do this one. It is a lot, absolutely abhorrent stuff. But obviously my heart goes out to all the families affected. Those are the real victims in all of this. And I hope Shoko Asahara is rotting in hell where he belongs. But with that, that is the end of this deep dive. Let me know what other deep dives you want me to do. I always read the comments. That's where I get literally all my ideas. So I really appreciate you guys being here. Please, please, please be safe. And I will see you in the next one.